UN Charter stresses that the Security Council can use all necessary means to prevent conflicts and maintain peace. These means, as you know, include the interruption of economic and diplomatic relations, embargo, and eventually military intervention. It seems a common belief that conflicts can only be stopped by force and threat. And besides, there is a lot of resistance among the UN, international organizations, and among governments about adopting a nonviolent option to overcome a conflict. So how do you assess this, and what would be your main recommendations to overcome and reverse this widespread belief among governments and international organizations?
Well, when we set ourselves up 10 years ago, we had done a study, we call it the feasibility study, which is available on our website. It is a thorough analysis of some 50 years of experience by usually small-scale, non-governmental, mostly non-governmental, sometimes also intergovernmental protection and civilians protecting other civilians. And we had come to the conclusion that there was a niche, that there was a special opportunity that had not been filled by any of the organizations yet, certainly not on a large enough scale that was commensurate with the extent and severity of the problems that we are facing. And so prior to getting to the use of force, which, as the UN says, is a measure of last resort, what we are saying is there is an opportunity for civilians, global civilians, protecting local civilians in conflict areas, and that niche, if it is adequately resourced, will actually preclude or preempt the need for DPKO to send in boots on the ground, so to speak. So we believe strongly that individuals who come with a certain ethos and work in organized groups, in teams, multinational teams, that are gender balanced. We have as many men as we have women in these teams. We believe that if we could scale that up to the kind of levels that we have in DPKO with the Blue Helmets, for example. Don't forget, there are some 120,000 or so Blue Helmets at this moment. Well, there are only a few hundred unarmed civilian peacekeepers or peace protectors or civilian protectors in the world at this moment. So as Mel said, it is a shortage of imagination that we just immediately think that if we have exhausted the preventive measures that you mentioned, the sanctions and the diplomacy and the mediation and all of that, if that doesn't work, well, then we'll send in the military peacekeepers. We believe there's a massive opportunity to scale up civilian peacekeeping and civilian protection, and we hope that the United Nations, particularly under the heading of civilian capacities, or mobilization of civilian capacities, that your previous speaker in this series, Mr. Jean-Marie Gaheno, has been promoting, that idea will become an accepted tenet at the United Nations within the next year.
And we are finding openings. As you know, we only come to New York occasionally, and when we've been here now for a couple of weeks in November, and we have found that there is a receptivity to unarmed civilian protection that we haven't seen when we've been here in the past. There's a number of reasons for that. First of all, there is questioning about the effectiveness of armed peacekeepers in every situation, and that there's some deep soul searching about that, especially in the areas of gender-based violence. Secondly, there's a financial imperative. Many, especially those who are paying the bills for DPKO, are saying that present levels are unsustainable. So we have to find other ways that will provide the kind of protection that's needed, because that need is there, and we must continue to push to meet that need, but to find it in not only field effective but cost effective ways. Thirdly, as Rolf mentioned, there is the openings that have come now with the report on civilian capacity in the aftermath of armed conflict, where there's a clear recognition that civil society has to play a major role in post-conflict situations. There's also some people are feeling burnt by the way in which the Libyan mission was carried out, how it was presented in terms of the protection of civilians, but changed to regime change. So even some groups that were advocating for this are now feeling that that was not the proper way to go. And so there are a number of openings that are here that we will continue to push through, because this will happen. This is an idea whose time has come. And so it's a matter of how quickly it can be developed and deployed.
We have seen many initiatives over the past 50 years of civil society, pioneering initiatives, quite often, innovations, mostly in the field of human development, development assistance, but also in the area of human rights. And so now we see, for the first time, perhaps on a larger scale, efforts to also, for civil society, to move in and provide their wherewithal and their resources in the area of human security, and particularly human security in the form of providing direct physical protection and safety to frightened, vulnerable civilian populations in conflict situations.
Thank you. Today we are witnessing an increasing use of force to resolve conflict situations. So so-called humanitarian intervention in Libya and the R2P doctrine are examples of this new trend in world politics. Could you reflect on this and give us your thoughts on today's use of force?
Well,
You've just mentioned something already.
yes. You bring up responsibility to protect, and responsibility to protect, as it was conceived and developed, was not an instrument for the use of force until the very, very last resort. There are all kinds of approaches in Pillar 1, Pillar 2, and even in Pillar 3 that can be applied to the protection of civilians. There is now the trauma of what happened in Libya, where there was a presentation of this being civilian protection when in fact it was an armed action for regime change. That unfortunately might temper efforts to protect civilians in other places. And I want to challenge the use of the word robust in terms of only applying to military interventions. There can be robust, nonviolent civilian missions where there are large numbers of both local civilians and civilians from the international community coming together. That is possible, and who will be able to do peace building and peacemaking, peacekeeping combined. And that has a tremendous chance to reverse the tide of the militarization of humanitarian space.
We are very concerned, actually, with the dialogue that's going on, the discourse that has private military security firms positioning themselves almost as if they are the new peacekeepers. We think that is a wrong direction to go. They occupy humanitarian space that should remain well within the realm of civil society, not-for-profit organizations that will bring people without arms with the courage of their conviction, and as Mel said, nonetheless, with a very robust and conscious presence. So it would be very unfortunate if in the next couple of years we see an expansion of the private military and security firms coming into this space and further strengthening the militarization of humanitarian space. The resources that are available to them, running into the millions, if provided to civil society organizations, would be so much better spent on civil society organizations and doing this unarmed civilian protection.
And remember, we're the fiscal conservatives. We're not the big spending militarists.
Rolf, you worked for various UN agencies since 1971. The UN is an organization that promotes peace but is increasingly using warfare. How do you assess the work of the UN in the resolution and prevention of conflicts?
Well, I believe that I worked particularly for a long period of time with UNICEF, and mostly in Asian countries, and I believe that the work that UNICEF and other UN agencies, many of them, in fact almost all of them, are doing the kind of work that is now often called peace building. They create the conditions through social and economic and often even cultural development that will make the world a more peaceful, a wealthier, and a more convivial space to live in for everyone. The grotesque disparity in income in the world that we see between the poor countries and the rich countries make for a very unstable global system. And I think more and more people are understanding that the globalization era that we are in is actually leading to more destabilization and potentially also more conflict, the resource conflicts that we see coming up, but also the ethnic conflicts that we see and the potential for mass atrocities in this century will not be less than they were in the century just past. So the whole United Nations and all its efforts at both political development but also social and economic development must be geared to the prevention of conflict and providing solutions, resolutions to conflict, but through peaceful means. That is what we would like to see happen. So I agree that we have never seen as many blue helmets in the history of the UN. The blue helmets are an invention of the UN itself. They were not even mentioned, as you know, in the Charter itself. And we have seen, therefore, an increased number of missions of DPKO. I believe there are some 16 or 17 at present. But we also have seen, at the same time, particularly in the last 20 years or so, a reduction in the number of violent conflicts, at least at this moment, and a reduction of the number of people who get killed in those conflicts. That's not to say that we are there yet. There is still an enormous amount to be done, and I think that more than deploying more armed blue helmets, now is the time for unarmed civilian protection through civil society organizations to come to the fore and to make its contribution.
Some NGOs are calling for more heavily armed peacekeepers with more robust rules of engagement. Could you give us your thoughts on this matter?
I think that, especially in the NGO world, we have to look at effective, peaceful ways of bringing about resolution to conflict. As I said earlier, sustainable peace does not come at the end of a gun. It comes through the solid kind of peace building and addressing the root causes, the structural violence that is, I think, on the increase in the world today. And so addressing that is an important role not only for the UN but for NGOs, and also then to work in conjunction, in coalition, to provide effective unarmed peacekeeping, and to really focus on building that up so that has a chance to show what can be done on a broader and broader scale. And so that's the most important focus for NGOs today.
To conclude, what are your main concerns and hopes regarding the use of nonviolent means to overcome conflict, and how do you see the work of Nonviolent Peaceforce evolve in the future?
My hope is that at a point our grandchildren will look back and scratch their heads and say, remember when they used to send in armed military battalions to try to bring peace? Remember when they did that? What were they thinking about? It can be done much differently. And that we can build the means to deal with conflicts, because we'll always have conflicts, and we're not against conflict. It's just there's too many dead people. And so it's ways in which transforming these conflicts away from violence. And there are many tools that are being developed at this very moment in terms of peace building and peacekeeping that, if allowed to flourish, will change the landscape of how violent conflict is dealt with in this world. And that can be done, and that can be done during our generation.
I believe that in the next several years, the idea that civilians can protect civilians and that civilians will protect civilians, that global civilians together with local civilians will protect other civilians who are under threat and who are frightened and who are vulnerable, that idea that civilians protect civilians will become generally accepted, including here at the United Nations.
Thank you. Mr. Duncan and Mr. Carriere, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on the issue of Nonviolent Peaceforce and for this interview. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your good questions.
Thank you.